Welcome everybody to our conversation on art and politics, the impossible topic. I guess because there's no real elegant fit between art and politics. To frame our conversation, I'd like to read a short quote from a speech Dubois made at the NAACP's annual conference in June 1926 on art and propaganda, and an anecdote from Ben Davis's book, 9.5 Thesis on Art and Class. These two texts have a slightly different emphasis, but both, in the last instance, address what the authors believe is necessary for art to have a radical politics. Dubois emphasizes the role of art in social change, believing cultural production should support and serve emancipatory processes. Davis, on the other hand, points to a global aesthetic politics that has effectively foreclosed the possibility of objects and forms having emancipatory potential. Instead, he indicates that at the intersection of art and politics is a condition that enables raced, classed, and gendered individuals to have a self-directed relationship to production. A condition that is not centered on administering and maximizing the profit produced by the labor of others, or on having to sell one's own labor power. We'll start with the Dubois quote. "Thus all art is propaganda, and ever must be, despite the wailing of the purists. I stand in utter shamelessness and say that whatever art I have for writing has been used always for propaganda, for gaining the right of black folk to love and enjoy. I do not care a damn for any art that is not used for propaganda, but I do care when propaganda is confined to one side while the other is stripped and silent." In December 2012, I found myself once again at Art Basel Miami Beach, the big annual art fair. I was taking a final walk around the convention center with a colleague, surveying the endless aisles lined with pricey modern and contemporary artworks. In my head, I was trying to make sense of it all, trying to figure out what to say about this kaleidoscopic panorama of money and art when something stopped me short. One corner of the convention center was dominated by a large plaza of rolling astroturf, designed as a kind of funky oasis where the fair-weary visitor could sit down and read the official guide or chat with friends. Booths dedicated to emerging artists were arrayed around its periphery. On this particular afternoon, the park was packed, mainly with lollygagging teenagers. The figure who had caught my eye was an older African-American man in a ball cap, sitting by himself and reading a book. Nobody seemed to be paying him much attention. He stood out mainly because he had 3 small hand-lettered cardboard signs propped up in the grass in front of him. They read respectively, "Art needs a home, homelessness is a condition, not a disease, and hungry, not starving." We paused to speak with him. At first, he didn't seem to want to talk, but when I said I was interested in the message of his signs, he began to tell me a story that sounded like a parable. He said that he was from Atlanta and that he lived in a studio at the top of a building. The view was so good, he said, that he didn't need a television. He said that from his windows he could see into a small park where homeless people slept at night. There was also some public art. Men and women who lived in the street would defecate behind it sometimes. The public couldn't see this from the street, he said, but he could see it from his room. He said the art had been built for the Atlanta Olympics and that the artists who made it were all dead now. But he thought that he wouldn't have minded, maybe, they wouldn't have minded, maybe, they would have even appreciated people getting some use out of their work. So what do you do, he asked me, coming to an end. What does an artist do about a problem like this? Now, the reality of Miami's large homeless population, juxtaposed against the frenetic orgy of parties and luxury events that populate Art Basel Week, is always one of the most disturbing things about the experience. And I was just about to tell the man that I was from New York and that I had been reading about how in New York we broke a record that year for the number of kids sleeping in shelters, 20,000 in one night. Our billionaire mayor, Michael Bloomberg, had cut subsidies for housing to low-income households, which had forced more families onto the street. I was about to say this, but right then, as if on cue, a policeman appeared. Lieutenant Carullo didn't ask the man what he was doing, or calmly request that he put his signs, not that either of these would have really made sense, put away his signs. Not that either of these would have really made sense either. His tone was immediately threatening. Sir, I need to talk to you right now. I need you to get up and come with me. The man with whom we had been talking later, I would find out his name, was F. Jeffrey Johnson, a poet and artist who had endeavored to catalog the stories of overlooked populations. He asked the policeman what he had done. Come with me, sir. Pack up your things. Come with me right now. In the end, Johnson was led away into a back room where he was accused of trespassing. When he was able to prove to the fair manager that he had bought a ticket, he was told that his signs counted as art, and that the fair did not allow artists to show works without permission. He was told that if he returned, he would be arrested. Or using these two texts to frame a set of questions, I thought we'd start by asking the panel, how do art and politics intersect in your practices? And could you provide examples?
I think I just need to say that the idea that there are these two polemics, that there's one extreme or the other extreme, in terms of my experience, is a false construct. I think that it's much more nuanced and a lived life as an artist or an intellectual or a laborer or a professor, whichever. I'm going to keep politicians out of that list at the moment. But that it's much more nuanced and operates on multiple levels. So with regard to my experience with art and politics, which is what you asked, I actually don't consider myself to be a political artist. I am socially engaged, and I really like the title of the keynote, the idea of being a public intellectual and socially engaged. My coming into my own understanding of myself as an artist was through the voices of others, listening to people who had public stage, on the radio. I love listening to people speaking. I don't listen to music. But over the years, I came to an understanding of what I cared deeply about. And in fact, most of those voices were the voices of people of color. And that was where I heard what moved me. And so and there were voices that were very much socially engaged, growing up in the 60s and the 70s, my formative years. And so the idea of a public artist was how I came to understand my vocation. I am an artist because I think or express myself visually, actually in my case visually and through the experience of space and time. But it was always in thinking about the idea of the audience as public. And quite honestly, when I think about those type of structures, I think about open public spaces, open institutions, and which is not to say that I have not shown in galleries, or gone to art fairs. I tend actually to not go to art fairs because I'm not really interested in that form of staging. But I'm much more interested in a type of, well, what was said, actually, I think this is a perfect segue from the last panel, is the idea that it comes from the bottom, and that it's what happens at the bottom, which is fundamental and forms the foundation. So I actually see myself more as a socially engaged artist because I'm involved in a communication, and that it is public, and that, yes, there are these class and economical structures, but quite honestly, I grew up in New York as a young adult in the ghetto. I didn't have heat. I mean, you know, for me, the activity was on the street. That was my affiliation and my kinship.
So I'm LaToya Ruby Frazier. I'm an artist and a photographer from Braddock, Pennsylvania. Braddock, Pennsylvania is a historic steel mill town that is the home to Andrew Carnegie's first steel mill, the Edgar Thompson Works, which still operates today, and his first library, the Braddock Carnegie Library. I grew up in an area known as the Bottom, along the Monongahela River. Braddock sits in the valley of the Monongahela Valley, and it runs along the Monongahela River. And I am first and foremost a human being that would like access to clean air, water, and employment. And when you come from a town like Braddock that's never addressed the historical racism and persecution against working class people and African Americans' contribution to Andrew Carnegie's history, that moves me and concerns me and vexes me. I picked up the camera and began photographing this painful reality because I was told I didn't exist, I was invisible, and it didn't matter. Being born and raised during the war on drugs, having to go to elementary school and being forced to, instead of reading history books that had more pages and chapters on African Americans, being subjected to listening to the police and canine dogs tell me, don't do drugs, I really built up a large resentment against it, and I knew that if I didn't speak to these inequalities and injustices, that no one else would. And so, in the vein of Gordon Parks, I began to use my camera as a weapon to fight back against all the things I don't like about America, which is poverty, discrimination, and racism. That's my job as an artist, is to question these things, make photographs that raise a critical awareness to these things, and as a social activist, to use my work to amplify the voices and perspectives of the people who have been marginalized and silenced, which particularly in Braddock are elder citizens, unemployed working class people, single parent households. I mean, the list can go on. And what's interesting about being in Braddock today is this has become a site of urban Rust Belt revitalization. And in the process of this new revitalization, artists have been used to co-opt and once again silence and erase those of us that have been there historically, generation after generation. And when you start to make work that addresses that, that is political in its own action. So I think it's a matter of kind of moving in between all those different realms and not necessarily having an answer, but asking questions.
Well, where art and politics intersect for me, when I first came here years ago, I met two friends, one of whom is in the audience now, Nelson Stevens. The other was Paul Carter Harrison, and they said that I was culturally challenged. So, so they took they took it upon themselves to attempt to broaden my political perspective, and include culture in it. Personally, in terms of art and politics, when I'm writing, usually at night, I play Miles Davis's Sketches of Spain, because one's responsibility is to try and write the truth, and not to project your own ego into the words that you are writing about. You're trying to communicate. I had a mentor once who told me, Bill, no matter how brilliant your ideas are, if people don't understand what you're saying, you're talking to yourself. So that I then try to think about how to be as clear as possible. And so I listen to Miles. And Miles helps me think beyond ego. And when I am outraged by racism, I reread Uncle Tom's Children. Have you ever read Uncle Tom's Children? It is the classic on racism in this country. There's never been a book before or after that describes Southern racism, its lethal nature, its capriciousness, as well as Richard Wright does in Uncle Tom's Children. So I recommend that you read Uncle Tom's Children, because that then brings us to the connection between LaToya and Anne. Because what they are using their skills to communicate is the other face of America. Mr. Hoover's FBI. And although Anne has these redacted pages, those redacted pages from 1942, the FBI began its surveillance of Dubois during World War I. They perceived Hoover's definition of communism was anyone who believed in the equality between the races. That was his definition of communism, and that was the FBI's definition. And that's what they say in the documents in relationship to Du Bois. And LaToya shows us about what, to paraphrase Carrie, the collapse of our country, what capitalism has done to this country. Because it's not just Braddock, and it's not just Detroit, and it's not just Camden, New Jersey. Every state in this nation is in deficit, because all of you sitting there paid more taxes than General Electric. And when you turn on the news to see what will happen in terms of the debt limit, it's because at this moment, while we are perusing and contemplating, America is now the greatest debtor nation in the history of the world. This country owes $16.7 trillion in debt. And because the corporations do not pay taxes, they must borrow. That's what the debt limit is all about. They must now borrow. And our number one lender is China. So what happens one day when China says, we're not giving those turkeys money anymore? What happens? What happens to this country? We are not, Americans, 44% of Americans get their information from Fox News, which is why the question, if art, whether it's the brother with the signs in the park, or whether it's LaToya or Anne, if we can help people to understand the reality that we have to contend with, that we need to fight against, then all praise is due to art. Because we are being lied to over and over and over again. One of the things I love about being outside this country is I can see the real Al Jazeera and even BBC World News, because the news here is censored. When is the last time once upon a time, despite my angelic appearance, I was in the Marine Corps. And I'm still in touch with the jarheads. In Afghanistan, while we are here, The U.S. Embassy in Kabul has a tunnel from the east side of the embassy to the west side because it is unsafe. It is unsafe to walk in Kabul from one side of the embassy to the other. When is the last time you saw anything approximating that reality on television? Or the alleged victory of the war in Iraq? There is a tremendous civil war going on in Iraq at the moment. So it is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a victory. But none of these things are being communicated to the American people because the concern, as Mr. Snowden and WikiLeaks and Julian Assange demonstrate, the necessity of a government with two faces is to lie and to conceal secrecy. Secrecy. To classify 2,000 pages a day of being classified. There is a State Secrets Act which Bush invoked. You remember Bush saying, "I am the leader"? He meant to say, "I am the dictator." So what is our country doing in our name? When you go abroad, you will see that the rest of the world, undeceived by the American population, sees America as, to put it mildly, untrustworthy. And in that respect, in relationship to Anne's revelations about Dubois and FBI files, we are all Dubois because we are all under surveillance.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about the role of cultural institutions as mediators for your work. We can talk a little bit about who the audiences are, who has access to the work that you make, the ways in which you engage with your audiences, which is really sort of addressing question number one. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'll highlight a particular project that kind of touches on everything you're raising. During the Whitney Biennial in 2012, I released a series of photolithographs that presented a counter-narrative against a propaganda campaign done by advertising agency Wieden & Kennedy and clothing company Levi Strauss, branding Braddock as the new frontier, and for hipster white artists, urban pioneers, to go forth and take our land and redevelop it. Coincidentally, at the same time that campaign unfolded globally across America and abroad, our community hospital was being torn down and demolished. And for me, being in New York City, seeing an image created of Braddock that was a fantasy and a lie that was folded with ways of trying to manipulate people in ideas of race, class, and gender, I realized that I was charged at that moment to respond. I started receiving phone calls and emails from residents from the community that were, outraged. The message that Levi's put forth with Wieden & Kennedy was that everybody's work is equally important. We are all workers, go forth. I thought that was a very ironic message, considering that we were losing our only hospital, our historic hospital, which was our largest employer, and our only healthcare provider, and one of the most polluted, red-lined communities in this country that people have neglected for decades. So on the one hand, in New York City, I saw billboards stacked 4 high on 8th Avenue, 7th Avenue, all along 42nd Street. And when I would drive home to Braddock, I would see elderly people outside in the snow, in the rain, all night, protesting with signs in front of the hospital as they're just destroying this thing brick by brick. I watched the New York Times and all the media coverage, talk about this campaign and neglect to say anything about these elderly citizens. And they formed a group called Save Our Community Hospitals, and there was about 12 of them. And so I went to them and I realized, like, this is where art and politics come together, when you take on that responsibility and duty, not only to say something, but do something and put it in history and take it to one of the most elitist institutions like the Whitney Museum. Like, this is what you have to do to counter all of that culture capital, to counter all those kinds of messages that have continued to silence and erase marginalized people, like what I was seeing in Braddock. So I began to collaborate and make the portraits with them, empower them, give them the agency to make the images they want to make, present themselves how they want to present themselves, send out the narrative and message that they wanted to put forth that the media refused to pick up. That became a very necessary thing to do. And so I put that series in there and then built a workshop around it where I taught docents, the curators, students about how propaganda really came into its forefront in New York. It came through Freud and his nephew. And they worked with corporations in New York City to manipulate us, like teach them about that, have them look at the pictures generation and how they contributed to countering and deconstructing all these things. So that's one example.
Well, I guess that just with regard to my relationship with institutions, I've used consistently having an access, the platform of the institution in projects I've done as a place to set out from. So for instance, my project here, yes, there's the singular piece of the doubly redacted FBI files, which is unique. But there are also 5,000 copies of selected pages from the FBI files that I've sort of constructed a brief narrative that tells in itself a picture, which are available throughout at various sites throughout campus that don't necessarily refer back to the exhibition, but there's some outside and they're at various locations where students meet and gather. So that's using the site of the entire university as, for placement of the work, outside of the people who would choose, for whatever reason, to go to the museum, which, as was mentioned before, looking at who's here, was not necessarily the full student body. So there's one specific example, but I think the idea of my production as conceived of as a multiple that can sort of coexist within different frameworks of institutions has always been part of my consideration. I have worked collectively over the years, either in terms of doing what would be considered direct political engagement or not necessarily culturally directed, but politically directed. And so so just as a concrete example, in 2005, working with the collective Artists Against the War, we put out a national call of artist activists, really no distinct definition between the two, but people who had done actions or works on the subject of the war against terror. It was a national call for people to just send us images and descriptions of what they had done. The only requirement was that whatever was submitted or sent to us needed to have taken place in a public venue. right? Meaning it could not be, images of war painted in a private studio. There needed to be a public interface. So we had hundreds of submissions. They came in. We put together, there were 5 of us from the collective, put it together. We ended up with a 3-screened 1-hour video that was called Disarming Images. 200 copies of that DVD. It was a 3-screen project. And with that, I'm not going to describe it any more in detail other than to say that 200 copies of that DVD were distributed internationally. We went and spoke, and always within the structure of an open forum. So what I thought was interesting about that was, yes, we went to universities, actually internationally. They did end up being more of the open forums that invited us. But so that project came from the larger public. We were basically just the collection unit. I mean, okay, we made certain aesthetic decisions, we put it together, but then it branched back out. So from the street, from the individual to the collective, out to ultimately public institutions. To me, my relationship to the institution, whether it's educational or cultural, has always been as the conduit, the place from which something is launched or disseminated from. I have never had access to the Whitney Museum, so I don't know what I would do in that case, but I don't necessarily see that I would all of a sudden change my behavior because the caliber or degree or focus of the institution changes. I hope that answers.
McLuhan said the medium is the message. And obviously we see in politics that money talks because it's all about commercials and everything else. So how are you leveraging media, internet, visual, YouTube, etc., to disseminate your art and communicate your message?
I've never deceived myself that the campus was the locus of struggle to change the world, so I attempted to do things off campus. Institutionally, to try and reach people, we did, if you've ever seen Eyes on the Prize, we tried to tell the story of the movement in Eyes on the Prize. If you've ever seen the PBS documentary on Malcolm X, called Malcolm X Make It Plain, which you can get the video, but they do not tell you, which I consider a left-handed compliment, they do not tell you there's a companion book to the PBS documentary, also called Malcolm X Make It Plain, written by the person who is now speaking to you. So I consider that a left-handed compliment as well. And then I ran Jesse Jackson's campaign in New England in 84 and 88. But at the moment, the world is not, the world of censorship is not open to voices. I used to write for Essence, for example, and I wrote a piece on Clarence Thomas, which evidently frightened them to death. They said it would scare they were afraid it might scare off their advertisers, so they gave me a kill fee, and that was the end of my relationship to Essence. But I'm also on the board of SUT, Stand Up. Stand up. There is an organization called the Media Education Foundation, which produces videos, many of which raise the issues of gender, of capitalism, of racism, and SUT is the executive director of MEF. So I would urge you to go to your computer and look up MEF and see all the wonderful videos that MEF, with the help of his advisory board, do produce. Yeah.
I think it's important that I get back to Dubois, because this is why we're here, and highlight what's going on with the new series of photographs I have on view in the exhibit. The title of that series is a despoliation of water from the Monongahela River to the Housatonic River 2000, 1930 to 2013. If you go into the exhibit and you stand in front of those images and take a careful look at them, I typically work in gelatin silver print. So this, you know, thanks to coming here and being challenged with trying to think about Du Bois and visualize all his information, I've kind of broken into a new visual language and territory of how I've been making my work. What you're going to see are aerial views where I went up into a helicopter and flew over the Monongahela River and followed it from Braddock to Pittsburgh, photographing all the industrial waste along where we all live. The way that it is presented is through light boxes. They're Duratran print transparencies. I see those in a way as clinically and medically as the way we get x-rays of our bodies. So here I am surveying the land as an archaeologist, but giving you an x-ray of all the decades of debris and degradation to the environment, which has clearly impacted the inhabitants. The polished look that it has is an intentional kind of quotation and nod to the fact that the Duratran print is predominantly used commercially for advertisement. You see them at subways, buses, different stores like Macy's and all these shopping areas. But instead of giving you something that is, you know, therefore to be commodified, I'm not advertising anything like that. I'm advertising the end result of capitalism and the destruction of environment, which has destroyed the bodies of the people that are there. So that tiny subversion, without being so heavy-handed and didactic, I think is very important to slip that in subliminally to the viewer. And so that's one way I'm disseminating information using media. And of course I have small documentaries online of different things that I continue to raise about Braddock and America and global economy. But if you take a look at that series, it has its subtlety to pointing out how to subvert advertisement.
We know that Du Bois, very early in his training at Harvard, was taught to intellectually undergird capitalism, but it wasn't until his time in Europe, when he began to read Marx and others, that he of course joined a socialist club and actually began to engage in a critique of capitalism. Some images of that in the Philadelphia Negro, but especially in The Souls of Black Folk, where he's talking about, of course, to be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the very bottom of hardships, all the way to the wings of Atalanta, where he's actually engaging in a critique of materialism that's emerging in Atlanta. So you can see him really wrestling with art and politics. And even in a short story that's actually Jesus Christ in Georgia, he writes in 1911, but then becomes Jesus Christ in Texas in 1920 when he publishes it in Dark Water. And it leads to my question, which is this. I'm curious about how all three panelists are defining the public, because I think in a number of instances, Du Bois is kind of clear about what the public is, where you're talking about, at least early in his life, when he's talking about the talented 10th, and then later on. But when you consider movements like the Occupy movement, which of course you're talking about the 99% and the 1%, but the 99% being very fragmented, all right? The 99% isn't an entire 99%. You have people of color who are being incarcerated. You have people, white people in the Occupy movement saying, talking to the police, we are one of you, but that's not the experience, according to James Baldwin, when the police are a colonizing force. So I'm curious about how you're defining the public and how art really relates to the public you're conceptualizing.
I'm interested in knowing, I'm thinking about, when I think of political art, it's easy to, or it's not so difficult to assume the existence of a certain message or a cause. And I'm wondering when art becomes didactic, and if it should be, if you think it should be didactic. That's my question. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your question about the idea of, well, the public, which public? Obviously, there are many publics. And in the case of the Du Bois show here on campus, it would be predominantly who is on campus, and those are people who are involved in secondary education, or the community. I mean, Amherst is a long way away from New York or Boston, so I guess that it would be this, in this case, this generalized area. What I always thought of in terms of the public is that that has to do with my intentional creating of works that get distributed in a way where who's walking by or who happens to be handed one of whatever it is, or who bumps into it on the public square, that the public is a collection of many people who have entered open public space. I happen to be deeply committed to the urban center. So you take New York. If we're going to talk about New York City, well, who is the public in New York City? Well, take a square. Who might walk through that square? And so the public becomes a cross-section of, I suppose, happenstance, culturally diverse, economically diverse, of different political persuasions. My understanding of the state university is that for those, well, the idea of the state university is that it provides accessible secondary education for those who desire it. I mean, obviously, we know that that's increasingly less and less affordable. So the idea of the public is as open as one can possibly imagine, given physical circumstances.
I think of the whole world as the audience that needs to be reached, because we're living in a different era now. One could argue that feudalism was rational. One could argue that slavery was rational. But what global capitalism is doing is threatening human existence now. 25% of the reefs are dead. If the reefs die, the ocean dies. If the ocean dies, we all die. The oceans are more and more acidic. The carbon emissions are, the scientists say, if we don't do something about them, and indeed it may, if we don't do something about carbon emissions, the whole planet goes bye-bye. Pick up your paper and read about the dolphins and the fish. They don't tell you about what's happening at Fukushima. There are 6,000 nuclear rods at the Fukushima plant. If any two of those rods come into contact, there will be a nuclear reaction 15 times Chernobyl. If you know anyone in California, the results of the contamination of Fukushima is manifesting itself in cesium-contaminated fish washing up on the shores of California. So unless we begin to understand what capitalism is doing, what these lunatics, as I said, feudal monarchs and slave masters were rational, but these people have let loose forces that they cannot control. Why is cancer epidemic these days? Why? It used to be women got breast cancer and men got prostate cancer. Now it's all kinds of brain cancer, all kinds of thousands of different cancers. Why is that? And why aren't we trying to find a cure for cancer as opposed to subsidizing Exxon and Shell and British Petroleum? The country is corrupt. Its political system is corrupt. It is bought and owned. The same people who are talking about they're against Obamacare last week went and got all their free physicals before Obamacare came into operation. Half of the people in Congress are millionaires. So their little rhetoric about this, I mean, how can a party that is anti the minimum wage, is anti-union, is anti-everything under the sun, Planned Parenthood, how can such a party still be seen as legitimate, except the media will not expose, as a commentator on NBC said last week, he didn't think it was his job to expose Republican lies, to fact check what Republicans say. So we are in the hands of people who are not only racist and who are not only stupid, but some of them are quite idiots. They are idiots. You know. So we need to rise up. We need to explain to people the dangers that we are now facing, and we need a movement that is adequate to the scope of those dangers.
I think that it's important for artists to be present in the communities from which they come from and are concerned about, as well as at the institution, at the school level, as well as at the museum spaces. You have to be that bridge between all these areas, and I mean, that's a heavy duty and responsibility. But I remember going to grad school thinking, you know, I finally have this access to this privilege and knowledge, but you know, my mother and my grandmother, who I was collaborating with, weren't exposed to that and don't have that access. And so, you know, how do you carefully take the time to construct a way to bring that bridge and that social understanding? How do you get working class, poor people in these institutions? Like, I'm all about challenging the institution. Like the solo show at the Brooklyn Museum, A Haunted Capital, was all about seeing working class, marginalized women and children in our communities in that space, because we're not allowed to be in that space. We're not supposed to be the subject of that space. People see these things in good and bad images, when that binary is one of the most destructive things. It's dehumanizing. It says you can't exist, you can't have a voice. So I think in order to be a successful artist that creates an audience and speaks to it, you have to know what type of, in your medium, in your practice, what you're speaking to, who is it on behalf of, and also challenge everyone that's going to come and interact with that. You can't control the way that people are going to project things onto your work based on race, class, and gender, because they bring their own to it. So in that sense, you can define your audience, but at the same time, you cannot, and I don't think that you should try to limit that. You know, I'm open to whoever wants to engage with it, because at the end of the day, in my photographs and talking about what it means to live in a post-Fordist economy when your environment has been destroyed and you all have terminal illnesses, that's putting it back out there for you. Every single last one of us are going to become elderly people. Every single last one of us have to deal with our health in this healthcare system in the United States. You know? So it has, my work has so many universal themes for people to pick up on. And I think the beauty of me being able to come across, you know, the Philadelphia Negro here and look at some of his letters in the archives here, was that it finally struck me that, you know, clearly Dubois was sensitive about good and bad images and who would be seen. And I understand in his time that it was necessary not to make those images of the statistics that he came across about the conditions of African Americans in Philadelphia. But because of his research and writing, because I'm not a sociologist, I realized that I am being inspired by his information to put a face and a name to this type of injustice. And I feel like because he's done that groundwork, it's okay for me to now speak back to that, but through a visual language of the photographs. Like, we have to do that now.
Thank you, LaToya. I was thinking about one of the things about the nature of the FBI files was that, as well, I apparently don't have all of them, but I'd like to see the rest of them. But the ones that I have were really focused most of the pages are focused when he was 90 to 94 years old. And, you know, Du Bois came to his understanding, his ideas, and his beliefs through traveling consistently around the world and seeing the way people lived. And that his ideas, as they developed in terms of what would be the best social structure for specifically people of color to organize themselves, followed a socialist model. And if you think about how he, well, and being restricted because the U.S. State Department continually took his passport and made it impossible for him to travel. But as he increasingly collected more and more information and became more informed globally, if you look at the same time and you compare the FBI files, the degree to which the redactions increase. So what to me, the paradox, but also the sadness of it, was that as he became more and more the sort of collector or witness of global structure, he was increasingly silenced and prevented. So there we have these two things happening, and the degree of what's taken away and removed in terms of the redactions in the files, what they were doing, how they were following him, and what they were saying about him, really speaks to the degree to which they attempted to silence and prevent him. And that's not rhetoric. That's not, if we're talking about, you know, art being polemical or political, that's not rhetoric. That's actually physical evidence. Look at the files. Most of what was written by the FBI is blacked out. We still today are not allowed to see fully what they were doing.
Du Bois didn't give a whit for anything that wasn't going to aid the cause. So obviously his position would be art should be didactic. Again, as I said in terms of my own writing, unless you are creating for yourself. But if you think you have a message and you are concerned about that message reaching others, then of course that is didactic. But let me say one other thing. Du Bois when Anne is talking about his global travels, Du Bois went to Russia in 1926. He came back after that trip and he said, if that's communism, I'm a communist. And what he then tried to do is to reach out to a guy whose name escapes me at the moment, who was the major theoretician on cooperatives. And he wrote this guy and asked him whether or not he thought it would be possible to have co-ops in Harlem. So obviously what he had seen in Russia made him think about some kind of American version of Soviets. He was teaching Marx at Atlanta University in 1935. But the FBI is kind enough to say he is a potential subversive, but he is not a member of the Communist Party. Even the informants could not come up with. And the nature of the informants is really kind of interesting when you start reading the files. You start asking yourself, well, who was it who knew all about what he and Shirley were doing? And then reported to the FBI. Who were the informants? Interesting question.
I want to congratulate the high level of our first two panels and having been launched by this amazing morning. So thank you. This is an overwhelming afternoon and to be continued an extraordinary level of conversation. Thank you.